Hello everyone, and welcome to our second episode in our current series of webinars on COVID-19. This is being recorded and it's going to be available via our COVID-19 toolkit that we just released last week, so it will be included as part of that. Just some sort of housekeeping before we properly get into the flow of this. Today we do have closed captions that are available for this presentation, and they're provided by our friends at Etiquette. You can choose this by clicking the closed captions button at the bottom of your screen, which is next to the chat options. If you need to adjust the caption size, click on the arrow next to the stop start and choose video settings and click on accessibility. I think it's also fair to say if you've got any technical questions, post these in the Q&A and my colleague will help you with that. And then generally as we're going through and having a bit of a catch up and asking our panelists some questions, if you've got any questions, please do post them in the chat and then we'll come to those at the end of the session. Just to introduce myself, and I always forget to do that, I'm Lucy Ruck, I'm the Taskforce Manager at Business Disability Forum, and I manage the Technology Taskforce. And as today is all about technology, that seemed quite appropriate. Just to give you a bit of an introduction in terms of what we're looking at covering today and kind of framing this for you. There was once a time, if you can remember, where people had to ask their line managers if they could work from home, and employers would consider whether it was possible for that job or that person if employees would really be as productive from home. Those days have obviously now gone and things have changed. Anyone who can now has to work from home. So what has this been like for disabled people? So today we've got a bit of a mix-up on guests, and I shall come to that in a minute. We've got someone who's worked from home for a few years. Actually, quite a few of us on this call today work from home and have done for a little while, and some who are all over the place, working in different locations. And we're going to just find out a little bit from them. All of them are part of the Technology Taskforce or connected with Business Disability Forum, so are well placed to talk about the challenges and the opportunities that technology brings to this situation and in the future when this is all just a distant memory. So I'm just going to introduce our panelists. Just to start off to say we were hoping to be joined by Neil Eustace today at KPMG, but due to unforeseen circumstances, he's been unable to join us. So we're sending our thoughts to him and his family at this time. But at very short notice, literally 2 minutes ago, Mark Russell stepped in from KPMG to join us on this call. So thank you ever so much for that, Mark. We're also joined by Darren Rowan, Programme Manager at Lilly. Give us a wave, Darren.
Hi, everyone.
Hiya. And also joined by Hector Minto, a Senior Technology Evangelist in Accessibility at Microsoft. Hi, Hector.
Good morning, everyone. Hi.
And last but by no means least, my colleague Bela, Head of Legal and Content, who is here for a couple of reasons. Just in case technology fails and we're all working from home, we thought it was good to have a bit of contingency. It's always good to have a contingency plan for these things. And she's also going to help with the questions at the end and if there's anything legal and anything else we need to know. Hello, Bela.
Hello.
Okay, so I've got some questions here. Excuse me if I'm reading stuff off, but otherwise goodness knows what I'd come up with, so it's probably safer for everybody. Okay, so the first question is about meetings. Now, of course, we're all using technology for our meetings these days as we're not able to meet up in person. People are using a variety of different platforms such as Zoom, Skype, Blackboard, and Teams. Teams are in there, Hector. How accessible are they, and what are the challenges that people with different types of disability might face? So, coming to you, Hector, I think, if you can tell us about some of the accessibility features that are in Teams and Skype and maybe Office 365 as well, that would be great.
Yeah, so we're starting to see, increasing inclusive design features, I would say, as opposed to specifically accessibility features. But things like auto captioning are becoming more commonplace across most platforms. In the chat, we have the immersive reader for dyslexia or reading disabilities. We also have live translation of chat, so that people who are can convert the text into their preferred first language. So these things are being very deliberately put in to drive accessibility. But perhaps more important, I think, for accessibility is that people start thinking about the way that they conduct meetings. Yeah, so things like turning the camera on doesn't always feel natural to everybody, especially if they're, forgot to put their makeup on and or forgot to brush their teeth in the morning and they just feel less confident. But actually, educating people that these are inclusive behaviors, things like having plain black background so that people can lip read more effectively. Things like recording. I mean, you know, people who are watching this webinar afterwards didn't have to be here at this specific moment to benefit from the information. Take that sort of situation into the workplace as well. I mean, I work for a global team, so I'm missing meetings in the middle of the night. I ask my colleagues to record meetings so that I can listen to them afterwards. And then, of course, if you're listening to meetings afterwards, all meetings, say within Teams, are automatically transcribed now. So you can actually keep up with the text as well, even if you would prefer not to have attended the actual physical meeting. So are these accessibility features, or are these just good inclusive design? The main challenge, I think, is getting people to know that these things even exist. Yeah, and that they know that they're there, and that they can start to attend these remote meetings in their own preferred way.
Thanks, Hector. Darren, I was going to ask you as well. Again, you're a home worker a lot of the time. I've just realised I skipped over my slides quite badly. I got too focused on the bit of paper in front of me. So I'm just going to go straight into the questions there. From your perspective, how do you find the remote working and the video conferencing aspect of it? How accessible does that work for you?
Yeah, so to set some context, I guess, first of all, I'm visually impaired, so I use Zoomtext Fusion. So it's a combination of a screen reader and magnification, but I use the magnification at very high, so it's like 12 times. So I probably see like a 12th of the screen when I'm looking at it, which means that most of the time I don't want to rely on the magnification because that's too much strain or slow. Sorry, I'm just going to remove my other earpiece. So quite often when I'm using some of the things that Hector's described, I've got a additional sort of earpiece in one ear, and I'm listening to the screen reader, especially if I'm presenting something in a meeting, and at the same time I'm listening to people in the other ear when we're having the actual conversation, you know, and listening to people on the call. So there's a little bit of that to contend with anyway when you're in that particular situation. Now, the things that I use Teams, I use things like Yammer and SharePoint, so all those good Microsoft products that Hector will be pleased about. I think that I think Teams is great in terms of the having everything in one place. I wouldn't say it's naturally intuitive for someone with a visual impairment. I think that, having said that, there are some really good guidance out there from Microsoft. I would really advocate companies to push that out alongside the deployment of things like Teams or anything else that they're saying this is our go-to package, because you do a lot of trial and error yourself and you end up getting quite frustrated. And I know some visually impaired colleagues who've been put off using some of these things because they haven't been given any training or even just haven't been pointed to a simple link. And you know, Microsoft are very good at this, that they will provide guidance on use with screen readers. So the first recommendation I would say is when you're putting anything out there, also put out what are the things that would help you to be able to grasp the concepts of using that.
Yeah, and I know we've got Mark on the line, and again, he's joined us at very short notice. Did you have anything to add to that, Mark?
Hi everyone, firstly, and I guess just for everyone's perspective and context, I actually use Zoomtext as well. I've actually got the same eye condition as Darren as well, so I don't really have to explain how I use my computer. It's essentially in exactly the same way as Darren does. And in terms of all of those aspects in using, like we use MS Teams as well, I've been kind of finding it manageable. I guess like Darren said, I wouldn't say it was intuitively built for someone with a visual impairment, but actually the guidance that Microsoft have provided is quite useful. And again, I've only just started really using it quite recently, so it's been kind of a real learning curve for myself. I often find with most of these kind of things, it's almost good to kind of get to throw yourself into using them, because a lot of actually the best kind of learning and sort of effective ways of using a lot of the technology is often done by sort of trial and error and getting used to using them. So actually having to use it in this situation, although the situation is a difficult one, it's actually going to be quite effective, I think, for myself getting used to using some of those technologies.
That's really interesting. And actually, let me share some couple of anecdotes from the last couple of weeks. We have a disability answer desk at Microsoft, and honestly, you can book one-on-one time with people through me. I mean, come and talk to me about that. But we've got a lot of people who are using assistive technology and who have maybe kind of avoided jumping in 2 feet, into remote working or into the remote systems or into Teams, particularly from my perspective. And we've been having one-on-one sessions with people to help them with some of that navigation, because I've got to be honest, Teams is big, it's vast. Yeah, it's not just calls, it's file sharing, it's documents, it's chat, it's everything, right? So it's difficult for everyone to navigate an enormous piece of software like that. It's a completely new way of working. And so actually just spending time, investing time in yourself as we all get used to this new period of remote working is something I would encourage everyone to do. And it's not just us that have done some great, I mean, Google have some great support as well, but also the assistive technology manufacturers. So Freedom Scientific have also put out some really good training collateral on remote working and your assistive technology. I'd make one other quick point as well. There are many, many people who will not have been supported by their employer to take their assistive technology home. So they may have kind of been moved onto, a personal device with a login, but don't have their installed software that they were used to their desktop computer in the office. So there's also this real requirement, I think, of people who've maybe become very used to, say, Zoomtext, the software they love, but then also making sure they understand that the iOS has some great magnification in it, Windows has some great magnification in it now. So there's a kind of almost like become this forcing function for us to become hybrid in the way that we use our assistive technologies.
I think there's also a lot of assistive technology companies out there, Hector, who might have had quite rigid licensing in terms of you can only install it on one device. And my advice would be reach out via your IT departments to say, can we be flexible, or what options are there to allow them to use the software that they're used to on a different piece of kit, basically, because we're all having to be flexible at this time. And I think we've been in touch with a couple of different companies, particularly with Claro and with Mindview, who said, please just get in touch with us and we can sort that out for you. So I think, I completely agree, there are options, but it's there's lots of many choices, I think, for people, aren't there? So it's good to know that those are available.
Can I add to that as well, Lucy? I think that's been really positive that actually, again, everyone is kind of coming together to share their solution, software, advice, kind of guidance. So I think that has been a real positive as well, how people are then sort of willing to share what they have got and advice, guidance, tips. So that's a real positive from that perspective.
Thank you, Mark.
What I will say as well is the apps, and I don't want to kind of make this all about Teams, but obviously it's something we're using a lot in our company, but the Teams and the Yammer apps are really easy to use for someone visually impaired. So on an iPhone, actually sometimes I would just preserve some time and say, I'm not going to try and just do this on the desktop. I'll take half an hour at whatever time, and I'll just go through some of the things I've been seeing in my different channels and just quickly go through it on my iPhone, because it's so much quicker.
Sometimes it's finding the workworkarounds that are just practical, isn't it?
That's
so
right.
That's useful.
I'd reinforce that as well, and just say actually the Teams app works brilliantly on my iPhone and through VoiceOver. So that's a really good point.
Not your Windows phone. Joke.
You still do those?
I have to get that in once a webinar, right?
Other phones are available.
My wife still uses a Microsoft phone, believe it or not. Hey, Lucy, can we talk about accessible documents?
We can. Do you know what? Funny enough, Hector, that was my next question. How did you know? It's like you can read my mind, isn't it?
It's just the conversation thus far has been about the individual making their own adjustments, but actually there's a real opportunity to build momentum around accessible websites, accessible biz apps, accessible documents, and maybe start putting the onus on the people who are sending you things, not just on you to make stuff accessible. And I think that's I'd love to have a conversation, with Darren, Mark about maybe should we feel more confident in this period to ask people to provide you with accessible content?
Darren, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's very topical for us. I mean, I'm leading a program right now all about accessibility improvements in Lilly, and one of the things that we're doing is promoting this whole accessible communications piece. So with things like the accessibility checker that's now in all those Office apps, obviously things that we've had from the BDF before in terms of best practice guides around organizing events, but also organizing your email marketing, things like that. So we've got a whole bunch of collateral. There's lots of things there, and people just aren't aware, first of all, of some of the simple things that they can do before they send out a newsletter or a PowerPoint slide or whatever that might be. So I think education is key. So we're going to be making people more aware through sort of an internal awareness campaign, and sort of housing some central repository, a sort of central site that will have all these good tips on there. But I think you're right. It makes so much difference to someone like myself when if you get a document that's they've just basically pasted in a PDF into an email that is just virtually unreadable. And it's so frustrating then because it takes so much effort to try and read it with your magnification, and it's so slow, and images are all over it, and there's absolutely no description of what that is. You're left feeling that people just haven't cared about it. And I think that's only the case if you've told people and they still haven't done anything about it. I think what the case is now is that people just simply aren't aware. So I think that is something that hopefully we'll promote more of, especially as people are doing more and more things virtually. But yeah, education is a key piece.
Darren, I was going to ask, what are some of the more frustrating things that happen when stuff isn't designed with accessibility in mind? Just a Word document. What are the things like, I'm thinking hyperlinks, I guess, must be an issue sometimes in terms of how they're inserted into documents or emails and stuff. Can you give us some examples? Because I think that always helps to bring it to life a little bit.
Yeah, I think more generally in Word documents, I don't experience big issues, but in emails, there'll be, people like to try and make these things look a bit more aesthetically pleasing, let's say. So they'll have a box there with sort of click here on it, but actually it's not then readable from the screen reader. So you'll be reading some of the context of the, let's say, a newsletter email that you might get. It will read bits of it out. It'll miss out some bits that are obviously part of an image. But then the actual piece to click on, you're going, well, how do I get here? How do I play this video? And you're searching around on there, and it just doesn't, it takes time. You end up getting frustrated with it, and B, you just, after a while, in some cases, it's been that poor that I just, ignored it. And, I've seen it recently with some things we've done on surveys as well, where you can't even access the survey well enough. So it's, that's another problem where you just end up not completing the survey, which is vital, obviously, to hear from people in your, disabled community.
Mark, did you have any thoughts on that in terms of accessibility of documentation?
Yeah, I mean, and interesting. I mean, obviously, I've had to step in last minute here for Neil, and actually, this is Neil's kind of real sweet spot, and he's done some great work at KPMG to kind of produce some real simple kind of guidance, some kind of like accessibility 101 sort of documents that just can provide people with that real understanding and reasoning of why they need to do that. Still, though, a lot of people across the firm would not have read those documents unless they were really out there looking for them. So it's still something we're trying to work on. And actually, quite nicely, fairly recently, a new graduate had joined the firm and had approached myself and Neil and was like, "Oh, we need some more like videos on like making documents more accessible." So they've actually just started producing some videos, again, very basic, simple kind of things that you can do, like just sort of like top tips of why it's important, how you can do it, and then the kind of practical reasons and help it will give someone that's then using a document that is accessible. So I think that's been quite powerful. Actually, what I had just started doing as well at KPMG is obviously we'd only just started adopting Teams, and I had spoken to a colleague of Hector's at Microsoft, and they were talking with our adoption team here at KPMG, and they were going to start actually looking at the accessibility piece and trying to spread it out wider across the firm. But actually, because of the current situation and us having to adopt Microsoft Teams in a much quicker time frame across the whole firm, that's kind of, we haven't been able to progress on that yet. But certainly, I think that's absolutely key. I think to get the understanding of I guess what the practical implication actually is for then the end users like Darren, myself, and other people that have got that sort of accessible need.
And I think that video content idea is actually really interesting as well, because I think there are many neurodiverse individuals who are very, very visual thinkers and really like that content. And actually, I'd probably rather watch a video about how to do something. If I need to do something technical, I am more likely to YouTube it than to try and look for a document that explains how to do it, because I think that's easier, because then you can see and everything else. So I think that sort of content works for many people, but is actually entirely critical for some people with disabilities as well. I'm going to move on a little bit, and I wanted to touch a little bit on meeting etiquette. And I know we've sort of teetered on the edge there with this one, but I think one thing that has become quite apparent in the last few weeks is the need for everyone to adhere to meeting etiquette. Now, quite often if you're in face-to-face meetings, you'll get little side conversations going on. Have a bit of chat on the side. Now, you don't get that on these meetings because, of course, you can only have one conversation at a time. But what you do get is the chat, literally the chat going on in text down the side of the screen. And I think that's very interesting. Again, Darren, you slightly touched on this earlier on, and I noticed you took your earpiece out because we have got people posing questions on chat, which is great. And I'm assuming that was coming through your earpiece and causing a distraction for you. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, especially when you're speaking, and that's something that I have constantly in meetings. Obviously, the more attendees that you have on larger meetings, then that becomes more distracting. And I do think the chat feature is great, and I do think we're in an age now where, you know, although I'm still quite old-fashioned like this, but I suppose when I go to conferences and then they encourage everyone to go on Twitter and talk about things, which I think isn't that rude. You shouldn't just be listening to people. But that aside, but I think that that's the kind of age that we're in, right? That people start chatting about the things as well in there. I think chat's absolutely fine and completely, you know, acceptable within the context of the meeting. I think that it's important though to make sure it's well facilitated, because when you're in a meeting and then, you know, sometimes yesterday I was in a well facilitated meeting where they said we're going to chuck some ideas down in the next 5 minutes, use the chat, then we'll talk about what's in there. And that was perfect. Nobody then carried on chatting away in there afterwards, and we just focused on that discussion. Whereas in other ones I've been in and we've talked about the first agenda topic, and then we said we'll move on to the next, but then people are still going on about the first agenda topic in the side panel, and it's very much like you said, that side conversation where people haven't quite left it and they still want to have a conversation about it. And you know, normally a facilitator will say in a room, let's park that now, whereas in the chat they probably don't even know sometimes it's still going on until somebody alerts them to the fact that, hey, this is happening and we're still talking about this previous conversation. But all the time that's going on in my ear as well as trying to listen to the conversation.
So do you sometimes just disconnect yourself from the chat like you did for this, or do you just go,
yeah,
if it's that important, someone surely will talk about it in the main conversation, or, you know?
If it becomes overburdening, I would just, yeah, take it out of the, you know, take the earpiece out there. However, if I'm presenting something and I'm relying on my screen reader, then I can't do that. I mean, most of the time I will put up with it. There's a bit of FOMO there. I don't want to miss out on something that might actually be useful as well in amongst it all. But it is difficult to kind of track when you've got a large meeting. You know, I'm talking, you know, over 50 people in some kind of presentation, and everybody's chatting away there.
And do we think there's any kind of... Go on. Is that Hector?
Mark, I think.
Oh, Mark. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, it was Mark. Sorry, Lucy. I was just going to say that I totally understand that as well. And often I'll find myself disabling the screen reading function on Zoomtext when I'm in kind of large meetings, just because it can become quite a distraction. But I think actually going back to a point Hector made earlier, and that Darren just touched upon there, actually, when you're facilitating a meeting, I think it's really key that you actually think about all of your audience and participants, because again, I think having a balance of whether you've got some people using that chat option because it might work better for them. I think if we look at some neurodivergent individuals, they might find it easier to use the chat box feature to send questions across, or to use apps like Slido to get questions across, but then also to have that balance, and also to be able to take questions audibly as well. So I think it's just to I think for people that are hosting, facilitating meetings, just to think up front, who is their audience, who's out there. Let's make sure that they're actually including everyone in that meeting, and getting full participation.
Yeah, Hector.
This all is based on the assumption that people are confident and totally relaxed about talking about their disability. And so obviously we've got to recognize that there's a lot of people in the workplace who have been covering disabilities and are now going home and actually finding that they're just more excluded by this new normal. So I think there's two things here. We need to start a conversation about being confident to talk about your disability, and that sounds so much easier than it might be for a lot of people. Because I think when you know what situation you face in a meeting, people want to be inclusive. I mean, I still consider myself to be kind of quite optimistic about this. I think when people know they want to do the right thing, or certainly they don't want to be seen to be doing the wrong thing, yeah. And so it's just about education. I mean, so this point that you're making, Darren, about the chat being fully distracting. Once people know, hopefully people make that decision to kind of, calm down on the chat. Likewise, when I'm working with my boss who's deaf, cameras on. Yeah, it's cameras on. So it's like, and she can then, when she's deciding who she wants to focus on, pin her interpreter, pin the person she really wants to listen to, and use all of the skills and all the information she has in front of her. So I think once we know, but when we live in a world where 3 in 4 people with dyslexia don't tell their employer they're dyslexic, then having full-on chat meetings might also be very difficult for somebody who has a reading disability. So we just, I think, again, going back to kind of what will we go back to once this is all over, I'm hoping we're going to go back to a situation where people have been forced essentially a little bit through the situation we've found ourselves in to kind of really explain their requirements, or feel more confident about explaining their requirements. And then we go back to workplaces where people feel that they actually need to invest in learning more about accessibility as a topic. Even Boris Johnson captions his videos now. Did you see that? Sorry, that's back to Twitter this morning.
I think it goes a little bit back to what you were saying as well, Hector, earlier about building inclusion into inclusive design, let's say, into products. It's also about the fact that people need to learn some of those facilitation skills, and it's not something new. It's about good etiquette in meetings that works for everyone, right? It's a bit like the story I know of a person with autism who was working in an office, and fantastic job he was doing every day, but he didn't go to these meetings, and the manager complained about it to the company that he'd been brought in from, and they talked to him about it, and he said, well, I didn't go to the meetings because there wasn't an agenda. And I thought, that's absolutely fair, right? Why wouldn't you have an agenda in the meeting? Because I didn't know what my purpose was. And I thought, isn't that applicable to everyone? So it's good meeting etiquette just overall will already get you in the right frame of mind in terms of inclusion.
So in the chat, we have a bit of a culture of people using GIFs all the time now as well. So people kind of add character to the meeting through kind of, posting funny GIFs. And I start putting alt text like in the next message underneath the GIFs. And it just that on its own, I've had people talk to me afterwards going, what were you doing in that meeting? And I was like, hey, we had blind folk on the call, right? Like those GIFs were completely meaningless to them. And so another part of this is about modeling. If you are into accessibility, sorry, my Bluetooth printer, my kids are printing homework. Sorry if there's some noise. But if you're modeling best behavior by, when you screen share, turning on your PowerPoint captioning, just to show that it's there, or if you're giving alt text in the chat, or when you put LinkedIn posts out and you're being deliberately visibly inclusive, I think that's also having an impact. I really think people are starting to see it. So I'm finding that we have kind of interns at Microsoft who are suddenly putting image descriptions underneath their LinkedIn posts, and no one trained them necessarily to do it, but they saw good modeling from other people that they wanted to copy. So I think there's this opportunity here as well.
And I think I just want to move the conversation on a little bit. I think it's quite fascinating about, we've had conversations about this week about who turns on their cameras. Now for this, we've kind of, it's a webinar, so we kind of have to be on camera, don't we? We think it's really interesting, those that do and those that don't. Hector, do you have any views or info on this one at all?
I mean, turning your camera on is preferable, right? So if you look at all of the research that's been done on socially intelligent meetings, so nothing to do with disability, but just general social intelligence, shows that you should be able to read somebody's, facial expression. When I say your hair's looking lovely this morning, Lucy, I can see how you respond to it. Yeah, I'll wait for the return compliment. I'm bored for the people on the call who don't know. So that's social intelligence. It feeds into how we use our own social intelligence. There's things like turn taking. Yeah, I mean, just being very deliberate about turn taking is another kind of inclusive behavior. Making sure that everybody in the meeting has had a chance to contribute. It's a new tool, right? So when people say, I don't like turning my camera on, they need to know the impact of not turning your camera on. So when I say to you, well, then I can't read your facial expression, well, that's quite a difficult conversation to have with some people, right? So it's, again, I think it goes back to modeling. If you join a meeting and 8 out of 10 people have got their cameras on, and people can then lip read and pin people according to their needs more routinely, well, hopefully the 8 have driven the other 2 on. But then there might also be other reasons why people find it very socially uncomfortable to turn their cameras on, and we should allow for that as well. There's no set answer here, but all the research on socially intelligent meetings show that actually captioning really helps. The turning the cameras on really helps, and the chat is actually also a really important part of that social interaction. Some of the most interesting research on this is actually where we're moving to avatars in meetings. So this is way beyond maybe this meeting, but if you look at things like HoloLens, where you can actually be in the meeting, but in a remote way, all of that social intelligence research is feeding into that. Like, there will become a time where actually we're not in the meeting, but we're all in a physical virtual meeting in body through technology, right? So
Yeah,
there's lots of really interesting research. I can ping some links around afterwards that help. One other quick tip on that though, shared whiteboard and shared documents. Schools already know that kids work better when they're working on a shared document and commenting on a shared document together. Yeah. But in the workplace, not everybody's got used to this concept of documents in the cloud and other people being able to contribute to it. So again, that's another behavior that will maybe change the more that we're not, sitting in the same room as each other. So I think there's quite a few things we can investigate there.
Yeah, and I think Darren and Mark, I know I've had this conversation with Darren the other day about, you're not a great fan of putting your camera on, particularly, are you? It's not your first choice. We forced you into it a bit today, haven't we, Darren?
Look, I don't mind if it's a straight case of a one-to-one conversation, and it's literally not about sharing your screen and things like that at the same time, because the issue that I have is that I get up very close to my large screen. So first of all, you wouldn't hardly see anything of me, or if you did, it'd be just a close-up of my ear or something, which I don't think would be, too pleasing for anyone. So that's my biggest reason. The majority of the time when I'm going on calls is that I'm either looking at somebody's screen being shared, and I'd love it if at some point the screen share would actually work with a screen reader. But that's difficult, I know. So I therefore have to get really close up and look at what's being shared, or I'm sharing myself, which again, I'm fairly close to my screen to make sure I can see what I'm talking about. So that's the main reason why. So the actual screen itself is probably blocking any kind of view of video. I do find it though quite awkward when people are then sharing their videos and I'm not, and it feels like I'm not being very socially inclusive, and then I almost feel a bit voyeuristic that I can actually see them but they can't see me, and I do tell people, well, I'm sorry I haven't shared my video because this is the reason why. So you know, I just, but again, I understand completely why it works. Again, it's sort of adjusting to the what is mainly a sighted world in that respect, and you've got to do that.
I'm just going to move on a bit to security because we've got lots of answers, which is great, but we need to move on a little bit. So we ought to touch on that. And as everyone works from home, are there more opportunities for hackers or cyber criminals? And are there risks in applications? So do we have any tips for staying safe online that we might want to be thinking about? Hector, I noticed you did something before we started the broadcast where you put a photo down, didn't you?
I did. I did. Yeah, well spotted. Yeah, I don't normally, if I'm honest. But I guess when it was like a major webinar, like, you know, lots of people there, you know, I guess you do make those decisions. You know, obviously we've got blurred backgrounds now are quite common in software now. You know, that actually came from disability. I don't know if people know that, but that came from somebody who's profoundly deaf who wanted a blurred background for lip reading for greater focus. But on the security side of things, I mean, I guess the general point I would like to make is that there have been many reasons why things like security have meant that people have said you can't work from home because of security. And I guess because of COVID, bringing us back to kind of the topic of today, they're having to rethink that policy right now, right? You know, you know, if you want to stay in business, you're going to have to let people work from home potentially. So the security versus work, and I would actually say security versus accessibility arguments that have been made for some time now, like, oh, we couldn't possibly turn that thing on, that, you know, that Windows dictate on because of security or privacy. You know, we're going to have honest conversations about that. So you know, working from home, you know, file sharing, where the people's ability to print documents out, you know, away from the workplace and all these sorts of things create security risks. But I would actually, as I say, I always like to be an optimist, and maybe I'm just naive, but I'm hoping that means that we can have truthful conversations about accessibility, what I would call, I wouldn't even just call it accessibility, I'd call it digital dexterity or flexibility of employers. And actually that might have a more positive impact on disability hiring and inclusion and real inclusion when we all return back to our offices. But security is of course an issue, right? I mean, you know, it's not just where your data sits, but it's just about keeping yourself safe and as you say, not oversharing, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm not a security expert, I would have to say.
I think interesting on the oversharing one, because I know some people now have stopped putting. I used to get a lot of people who send you their, you know, they're blocking their calendar for their 2-week holiday or whatever, and they'll say in their location they'll say Florida or Mexico or something, just to kind of brag about where they're going. But then people have stopped doing that. Not everyone, but I spoke to one person who says, "Oh, I don't even put that I'm on holiday now, just sort of out of office, because there was a spate of crimes." It was in the US, but there was a spate of crimes because people had seen they were out of the country, and obviously their houses were getting burgled. Now, if you think about that in terms of being home worker, then obviously I feel quite secure in the fact that nobody's coming into my house because I'm here. So there's that aspect that I don't feel that we're threatened regarding that. I suppose I don't think the security is any more vulnerable when you're remote working, because you're just using the same, you know, systems, built-in security that you get. You're working with the same policy as you would do within the office. So we're told to use the specific apps or systems to share files, whatever that might be, and have meetings. And we're told not to use other things to have business discussions on, including certain texts and text groups on certain applications and things like that.
But there does become an issue if you're using personal devices to make your information accessible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So of course, I mean, if you've not been sent an accessible document and then you have to turn to an app for some OCR, right, or you know, Seeing AI for kind of, you know, screen reading, you know, has Seeing AI been signed off by your employer in terms of where its data is processed for it to be analyzed, right? So you could find yourself breaking policy because you're trying to get round information that's been sent to you because it's not accessible. So again, it goes back to this thing of like, let's remember these situations when we go back into the workplace so that we can actually, you know, raise the importance of accessibility. I genuinely feel this whole topic, and we know just from the number of kind of customers who are coming to us to ask about, can you give our teams some training on remote working with disability in mind? You know, it is definitely bubbling up the agenda because of this situation. You know, we've all become more situationally disabled, right? You know, people who have covered for disability are finding that they can't cover anymore because we're all being forced to attend meetings like this, right? So I just think, you know, those of us that are, you know, attending and those who are on the call who feel like we're kind of activists in this space, like, let's remember these anecdotes, because I actually think they're going to help push the agenda forward.
We do have some more questions that I was going to ask you, but I'm just aware that time is running out and I want to make sure that we go to the people who have generously given their time to join us today. Bela, have you picked out any questions that you wanted to put to the panel?
Sure, yeah. So there's a few questions here for Hector about Teams. When will Teams show more than 4 people on a video call, and when will Teams have the same capability as Zoom about raising a hand, breakout rooms, etc.? That was from Sebastian. So what's the time scale? Is there one, Hector?
I love these, like, on the, you know, put him on the captive audience, put him on the spot.
Sorry, that.
I have the raise a hand feature on my insider version. Sorry, you will get it as and when. More than 4 on a call. It's definitely been raised. It's definitely on the roadmap. One of the issues we have is to do with, you know, bandwidth, actually. It's like, you know, when you've got multiple people sharing. So we don't want to ruin the experience for people, is what I heard. I'm not in the engineering team, clearly. But it's certainly on the roadmap. I mean, one thing I would just say about that is just please right click on people and pin the people who you want to see in a meeting. I always think, you know, how good is it to be watching 15 people at once on a call anyway? I don't know what the studies say on how optimal that is. But sensible decisions have hopefully been made on that. I'm going to say
Excellent. And can people dictate into Teams chat?
Yeah, using Windows dictation. Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Windows key H.
That's a good. That's great.
I mean, drag and dictate and others, I'm sure, work with it, but I know that Windows H, if you, on Windows 10, sorry, I mean, I always make the assumption that everyone's running latest, and your enterprise version of Windows might be different to your home version, but try Windows key H.
And here's one close to my heart at the moment, actually, because this is happening to me right now. Can you disable chat during a video call in Teams? Because I'm on a Zoom call now and I'm getting the chat from a Teams.
You can mute it. Yeah, you can mute it. And you can mute it afterwards. One of the worst things about Teams, sorry, that's the wrong language for a Microsoft person. One of my annoyances, personal annoyances, is the after meeting chat. You know, when the call's gone down, and you're like, I've gone now, and somebody's talking to somebody about the holiday. Just right click on that chat and mute it. Yeah, kill it.
All right, thank you. Here's one for Darren and Mark. People are asking about graphs and spreadsheets. How easy are they to read with assistive technology?
Nightmare.
Go
on, Mark.
Not that easy. So I guess it depends how. We're only going to be able to read them as good as if we're reading them on a screen reader. It's going to be as good as the alt text has been input to describe what's on the graph. So I think when people are putting in any kind of images or graphs, think about putting in that alt text and what that graph is showing. If there's any key data points, try and actually describe that. I guess myself and Darren obviously use magnification software as well, so we can kind of zoom in on graphs and kind of get an idea from looking at them that way. But it takes obviously a lot longer than someone just scanning through a document and looking at a graph and visually getting it. So it's it can be difficult.
Do you remember the color filters is another thing, just to kind of, you know, give yourself that different view in the moment. And also there is a really cool blog from the Power BI team who are doing some work on this about, you know, now that data is not just becoming somebody produces a chart, it's a dynamic chart, you know, because the data is constantly changing. They're doing a lot of work in Power BI on terms of how do we actually make this information usable for screen reader users.
Okay, and I don't know whether any of you can answer this, but we've had a couple of questions around people who use BSL and how to ensure that we're including people who are with severe hearing impairments. And is it possible to get BSL interpreters on a remote call? Anyone able to answer that?
I can take that. So you can have guests in Teams meetings. So in a work meeting, and again, this maybe goes back to the security and the privacy piece here, but any Teams meeting or group team has the ability to have guests. And I do think for some time we've been maybe ignoring this situation or not being very kind of clear about it. But you can obviously bring anybody outside of your organization into a meeting with permission. That person can then obviously be a sign language interpreter and be pinned during the meeting. The only thing we can't do at the moment is have screen content shared and pinned presenter, but that has been fed back to the team. We're working on that. So yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. The other thing, just quickly on that, I would just remind people of is if you're sharing documents and you want to be very deliberately inclusive, you can also record thumbnails of interpreters into PowerPoint presentations. And again, I don't think people have done that as routinely as they might have. So if somebody is on, if you do want meeting details or meeting notes to be available in sign language, you can just use the record function in PowerPoint to put that thumbnail in the corner of the interpreter.
Okay, and kind of related to that, this is one from NASA, is can somebody join if they don't have a Microsoft Office 365 account? So if you've got a guest interpreter who doesn't have a Microsoft account, can they still join a Teams meeting?
Yep.
Okay, that was simple. That's excellent. Okay, so I've got one here that's for me, actually, so I will answer that. It's, is there a legal requirement for employers to provide the same level of assistive technology to employees at home? And I'm afraid I'm going to give a lawyer's answer there, which is it depends. But broadly speaking, yes, they should certainly, if you're required to work from home, as we all are, if we can, then the employer should do what they reasonably can, their best efforts to actually make sure that the assistive technology is provided. Now, that might mean, as Lucy said at the outset, talking to the provider about the license, and some of them are being very flexible. Normally the licenses go with the computer or the device, not the person, but they are being flexible if it's being needs to be on a different device at home, or as a lot of employers are doing, and as Neil, who if he'd have been with us would have said, what he did when he realized that this was going to happen was he put everything, his 2 monitors, large screen monitors, and everything that he needed from his docking station into a car and took it home.
I hope you know that, Mark. Otherwise, that might be a bit of a shock.
Oops.
But yeah, but I think there are times when people just need to do that, don't you? If you need kit, by all means check it out. Don't just look like you're nicking it and putting it in the boot of your car. But people need these things for a particular reason, and I think employers have been very flexible. I also know, talking to one of our other Tech Taskforce members, a lot of them use laptops, so they've already got the kit they need. They've just taken it with them, and I'm sure there were some issues around monitors and so on, so people could have some flexibility around that.
Okay, and one question actually, which was something that was on our list, is that we've talked about technology, and obviously this webinar is called technology, but it touches on this whole thing. Somebody's asking about supporting people at work with learning disabilities, and I suppose it's a question I have is, can technology really provide all the support that a human being can? And isn't the most effective reasonable adjustment sometimes a human being, even if technology is cheaper? And that, of course, now human beings aren't possible right now, but looking to the future. So just putting that out there. Answer first.
Go on,
Go
Hector.
Are humans always going to play a part? I mean, it's like if you have the luxury of personal preference, you should be allowed to say what your preference is. But I would actually turn that the other way around and say, are we sometimes creating an over-reliance on humans and therefore stopping awareness that other options are available? So for instance, if somebody needs somebody to read a document for them, should we be living in a world where we say, well, you've always got to have a human to do that? Or should we always be living in a world where you say, well, you can just right-click in your browser and that document can be read to you? or should we just say both exist and, you know, situation should drive it? I think going back into your question, it's like, what should the driver be for that decision? Should it be budget? Should it be, you know, or should it just be personal preference? And we would always say personal preference. You know, you should be allowed to say what your personal preference is there.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, going on from that, as somebody has asked as well, is now that you can't have a support worker physically with you, how possible is it to have a remote support worker for somebody who needs that at home? Obviously, there are some things that just can't be done remotely, but have you come across examples where some of that is working at all?
Yeah, so I mean, what we're doing here in terms of, you know, video calls, we're finding that a lot of educators and support workers are turning to the technology. The one thing I would tell you there is that the digital skills of people who've delivered some of those supports for some time are maybe not there. You know, so when we look at, you know, support workers, do they have the digital skills to confidently set up, you know, a Zoom call and interact with somebody in the community? You know, we have got a lot of work to do to build the digital awareness and digital skills of people in those first line jobs, actually. And it goes down to teachers. I mean, I've got 2 boys, and I can tell you, I now know which school has the better tech, and which one's doing it right and which one's doing it wrong. I also have, my kids have music teachers, and one has managed to keep his business going, and the other one isn't keeping his business going because of their digital skills. So I think the way I'd rather look at that question is, will this whole process highlight the needs to really invest in the digital skills of first-line workers if you even want to have a conversation about the use of technology?
And actually, what I was going to do is, I'm aware we're getting near the end of the session here, and I'm very keen that we should finish on time. Is this the new normal now? Obviously, we've been forced into this situation. Well, some of us actually did it before, as we know, a number of us on this call do. And when it's all over, will people have to be working from home, have to carry on? And how is business going to react to this? You know, will that be? Would you think business would be more flexible about people wanting to work from home? And actually, there's some people who actually really like being in the office and like being surrounded by colleagues. And will that drop off? And will that be an issue for people? You know, social isolation in the office now, maybe. I don't know. Any thoughts on that? Maybe if I can come to you, Mark, where we haven't given you quite so much airtime. What's your thoughts on the new normal?
Yeah, and really interesting and sort of fascinated to see myself what does happen. I mean, I'd like to think that there's the approach that is taken is a balanced one, and actually that a lot of employers will see that a lot of jobs that maybe they previously thought needed to be done in the office can be done as flexible working. And actually, when we're advertising and recruiting, certainly employers will see that actually a lot of roles can be done flexibly. But again, I think hopefully they'll also be cognizant that some people do still need or want that social interaction as well. So I'd like to think there's a balanced approach, but it will be a good way, I think, for everyone to sort of experience maybe what it may be like working flexibly and understand a little bit more. Certainly, if they need to then understand why someone might need to work flexibly.
Thank you, Darren. Again, your homework all the time anyway, so this in so many ways is not new to you. But what do you think have been the big differences with in terms of your colleagues or your interactions from a standard home worker to people who are new to this?
I mean, I work in a global role, so I'm a global program manager. I was going into the office in the UK and ending up just speaking to people on Skype or now Teams pretty much all day. And for me, I was ended up doing an hour and 40-minute commute, you know, each way. So it then became, why am I doing this? You know, I was working from home once a week, and I could immediately felt much better. I just felt happier that I could get up in the mornings pretty much the same time and be almost twice as productive in a day. And at the same time, I could have that level of flexibility. So I could go out and walk the dog in the morning. My meetings were mainly in the afternoon with a lot of people in the US. So for me, it's it's made me a much happier person. My interactions have been no different. And actually what I would say now is, with everybody, because the majority of our people are in the US, they're all now working from home, and our virtual meetings are truly virtual. Before, there was 8 of them in a room and me on the other end, and it was very difficult. And I've tried to manage projects and things with people in that situation, and it is incredibly difficult. So I hope that when people do return back to the office, that they will, remember those experiences and now have a much better understanding of how it is for people who not necessarily are at home, but just aren't in the same country or building as them, and how they can work better in the future as well. I think this has been going on for about 5 years, this topic about this whole kind of 9 to 5 in the office concept. I think it's pretty much old school now, and there's much more kind of hot desking concepts and much more flexibility available, and I think it will just amplify that.
Hector, what's your view on this?
I just think that Darren just says it brilliantly.
Yeah.
The people who will be the experts, when everybody says, like, we're all remote working now, or we're going to get much more flexible, much of the expertise of how that's done will come from people who've always had to work flexibly and potentially remotely, which is quite often our colleagues with disabilities. So, become that expert, right? Put your hand up as the expert on remote working. I mean, clearly, Darren, you are, right?
Yeah, and I think there is something about being the advocate for it as well, and that's something that's come up quite a few times today. Be the one to say, this is how we can do things better. And actually, in our experience, I think we've all found that if things work better for people with disabilities or who need stuff done in a different way, they generally work better for everybody anyway, don't they? And I think that's entirely true of this situation, the meeting etiquette, how we manage the technology and everything else.
But we're not going back. Just to answer that part of your question, the number of companies we're speaking to right now who have been waiting to deploy Teams or to actually get their workforce over onto it. I've heard literally companies who've put thousands of people in a week over to Teams. Yeah, and so that move, once it's done, people won't go back from that. This has absolutely been a moment in time that will change things.
And of course, it's useful to remind everyone other video conferencing
Totally.
providers are provided and available out there.
I've tried to do that through the.
I know you have. I know you have entirely. Okay, so I think I'm sure we could go on with lots of questions I had to ask as well, but I'm aware we really need to keep to time on this. I think that's important. Obviously, there are other experts out there on this. Obviously, the World Health Organization providing current up-to-date information, and .gov.uk for those based in the UK. So please visit their websites for further info on the coronavirus more generally. And if you are members or partners of Business Disability Forum, we do have the advice service, whose details, advice at businessdisabilityforum.org.uk, are available, and they're still functioning and happy to support you during these slightly more challenging times, or as my son keeps writing to family members, uncertain times, out of the mouths of babes. He's 10, so the new language they've had to learn is interesting. So that just leaves me, I think, to very much thank our speakers, particularly for Mark Russell, who literally stepped in 2 minutes before this webinar started. So thank you ever so much for that, Mark. To Hector Minto, and to Darren Rowan, and obviously my colleague Bela, and also for those of you who've joined us on this webinar today. Really appreciate it. Really great to have some questions. You'll also notice that Hector's posted some information about Microsoft in that chat as well. This will all be available on the BDF website as part of our toolkit in the following days, so keep an eye out for that. And thank you very much. Bela, anything else we need to add, or anything I've forgotten?
No, that's all. So thank you everyone for joining, and I hope all your questions got answered.
Keep washing your hands.
Yes, wash your hands.
Stay at home. Lovely. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.